It's a privilege to be part of this, like all Niagara events of which I've been a part. Everything is so well planned and coordinated that it's up to us on the panels to now come through, and the participants in the audience will be doing the same. It's exciting to think that we're starting off with the concept of spirituality. It's easy to take a movement like this and move through it all and then say, oh, and by the way, the leaders are rooted in the spiritual dimensions of life. Putting it up front, I think, sets a nice keynote for what we're going to do, and we have three people who represent the kind of thing that is at all the Niagara events that I've been. It's a very cosmopolitan panel. Father Michel, I won't go into details of the biography, they're very well done here, but you can see from that training that his background in Islamic studies is a very strong one, and he's well positioned in the various Vatican commissions on interfaith relations, stressing around the world relationship of the Catholic Church to Islam and vice versa, and both of them to others. Professor Al-Mamuk is from northern Iowa. I'm a fellow Iowan way back, so I know how cosmopolitan that can be. Northern Iowa is anchored in all the rest of the world. It's not far from Postville, which is, has its own stories of extremism in Judaism. It's not far from the Transcendental Meditation University, Fairfield. So we Iowans know a little bit about the world around us. And his topic is also an interesting one. When you read his bio, you wonder, what is an educator doing in the company of forgiveness? And what's exciting is the way the concept of forgiveness is traveling from the various religious sects and texts and traditions into education, psychology, and human relations. And that will be his main topic. Professor Servanthood is from John Carroll University in Ohio. He's also done some of his study and teaching in Turkey, well equipped from there, University of Marmara, and is a real leader in these. And I think the choice of his topic is a surprising one too. We often forget that religious leaders, and in this case, someone who's also in education and business and world affairs, is deeply grounded in his love of, at the heart of this tradition, the love of the prophet. So we're going to turn it over to each of you, and I hope you'll keep your own time so I won't have to crack the whip. Father Michel, please.
Good morning, everyone. Dr. Marty, he didn't mention maybe the most important thing in my biography, and that is that I am a University of Chicago graduate. And this is my first time back here at my alma mater in, over 30 years, I guess it is. I want to begin this morning telling you about two real people. I've changed their names and the details of their biographies so that you won't know who they are. But these are real people. First one is Oz. Oz comes from a casually practicing Muslim family in Malatya in central Anatolia. He first came to know the Gülen movement as a high school student in Ankara, and shortly thereafter moved into a yurt, our residence, run by the community. He spent his last 2 years of high school there as he prepared for the dreaded öğrenci seçme sınavı, that is the student selection exam. This is the college entrance and placement exam taken annually by over 1.5 million Turkish students, and it determines the universities and programs that a student can enter. Oz placed within the top 1% of his examination year and was thus able to enter the Middle East Technical University in Ankara, one of the best universities in the country. There he took a bachelor's and a master's degree in physics, and he had a scholarship offer from a prestigious university in the United States. However, instead of pursuing this enviable career opportunity, Oz took up a job teaching physics in a high school in Kyrgyzstan. There he married a Kyrgyz teaching colleague, and after 8 years now, they have 2 children and are still living and teaching in that country. Second person I want to talk about is Erol. Erol is a businessman. He has his own plumbing supplies company in the southeast Turkish city of Gaziantep. He came to know the Gülen movement by way of his fellow business associates. For the past 10 years, Erol has donated 1 million Turkish lira, about $600,000, annually to the activities of the community. He has adopted, so to speak, one of the movement schools in Cambodia. This is a project he's never seen, but to which he feels personally connected and for which he provides funding. He has only met Hoca Efendi, as Gülen is affectionately known and called by those in his community. He's only met him once. And that meeting took place on a recent visit with other Turkish business leaders to Gülen's current residence in Pennsylvania. Erol's knowledge of Gülen's vision and teaching comes mainly from CDs, radio broadcasts, magazine articles that reproduce Gülen's sermons and discussions, often in question-answer form. So what are the values that have inspired Oğuz, Erol, and thousands of other Turks to sacrifice their time, talents, funds, and career to a communitarian project they call the Hizmet, or service? Obviously, the Hizmet is not the only movement in today's world that promotes altruism and philanthropy. Other associations, both religious and secular, could be named. However, there are many reasons for generous and self-sacrificial behavior, and it would be simplistic to assume that each of these movements is motivated by the same set of values. It's the purpose of this paper to try to point out the core values of the Gülen movement, the ideals that make them tick and operate, and which distinguish them from other groups and organizations that are also doing good things in today's world. First of all, the Gülen community is, properly speaking, an Islamic movement. Not merely a movement composed mainly of Muslims, but a movement shaped and guided by Islamic ideals and principles, sustained by Islamic practice and devotion, and committed to a vision of the role that Islam can and should play in today's world. For this reason, it is inevitable that the core values of the movement will derive from the Islamic tradition itself. In this paper, I'll take a set of these central values and try to show how they influence and help form the distinctive character of the Hizmet, or as it is popularly known, the Gülen community. Now, this community is inspired by the preaching and writing of the Turkish scholar Fethullah Gülen. It's Gülen's particular understanding of the teaching of the Quran and Hadith, and his appropriation of the way this message has been understood and lived and commented upon by Muslims down through the centuries, that provide the intellectual content of the movement and the ideals pursued by the community. Elsewhere, I have written about the concept of ikhlas, sincerity or purity of intention, as a key value that motivates the work of the community. In this paper, I want to focus on another central notion that motivates and characterizes the activities of the Gülen Jamaat. This is the important concept of ibadah, which is broadly translated as worship, and the related concepts of ubudiyya, servanthood, and ubuda, which we might translate as devotion. The terms translated in English as worship, servanthood, and devotion are all taken from Arabic, as you might have guessed, and possess a strong history in the Islamic tradition. Fethullah Gülen has applied this traditional language to the practice of Islam in modern situations. The term ibadah is derived from Arabic meaning slave or servant, and carries the idea of enslaving oneself to God, or of acting as God's servant with the connotations of obedience, submission, devotion, faithfulness, service, etc. In many treatments of Islamic belief and practice, and in the minds of many Muslims, ibadah is simply equated with ritual acts, specifically the ritual practices such as the daily salat prayers, Ramadan fast, pilgrimage to Mecca, etc., that are obligatory for Muslims, particularly in works of fiqh, our jurisprudence. Ibadah as a ritual activity is a separate chapter from muamalat and the other chapters. Muamalat is business affairs and that kind of thing. Now, Gülen expands upon this traditional view of ibadah to define it very broadly as, and here I quote him, fulfilling God's commands in one's daily life and fulfilling the obligations of being God's servant. It's interesting to note that there is no specific reference to ritual performance in this definition. In Gülen's view, ritual obligations are included in the concept of ibadah, but the notion goes far beyond ritual performance to include everything that one does to live and act according to God's will. When Oz teaches physics in Kyrgyzstan, he is performing ibadah. He is worshiping God. When Errol donates funds so that schools, dialogue centers, well-digging projects, and publishing houses can be founded and maintained, he is doing ibadah. His donations are a form of divine worship. Worship in this broad sense is the primary task of men and women as God's Khalifa, or vice regent on earth. And Gülen holds, and I'm going to quote him now, he says that humanity's vice regency takes place in an unusually broad sphere that encompasses acts ranging from believing in him and worshiping him to understanding the mysteries within things and the cause of natural phenomena. This insight has concrete application in the strong emphasis given to the natural sciences in the schools established and operated by the Gülen movement. The teachers and students are worshiping God when they undertake a scientific study of the universe and its elements. Gülen's comprehensive understanding of worship has resulted almost in a kind of sacralization of education and helps to account for the emphasis the movement has given to opening and operating schools, college preparatory courses, supplementary classroom instruction. As an example, I'll offer this passage from one of Gülen's writings on education. He says, I'll quote him, "A school is a place of learning where everything related to this life and the next is taught. It can shed light on vital ideas and events and enable students to understand their natural and human environment. A school can also open the way to unveiling the meanings of things and events, thereby leading a student to wholeness of thought and contemplation. In essence, a school is a kind of place of worship. The holy leaders are the teachers." Now, the broad compass that Gülen gives to ibadah is meant to have an integrating effect in the lives of his followers. I quote him again, "They arrange their feelings and thoughts, regulating the individual and social life through various forms of worship, balancing familial and social relationships by their actions. The far-reaching notion of worship enables the members of the movement to bring together and maintain in equilibrium their devotional life, their vocational commitment, and their communitarian responsibilities. Now, to play this integrative role in the life of the believer, worship must embrace the totality of attitudes and actions of service. As Gülen notes, I quote him again, worship is not simply the performance of a set of particular movements, as some believe. It is what we call complete submission and acceptance of broad responsibility. It is the clearest expression of the relationship among humans and universe to God. So worship is seen not to have only an integrative, but also a liberative role in the believer's life. An attitude of worship enables the believer to arrive at true freedom by becoming free from the obstacles to freedom, escape from the self-imposed dungeon people have created for themselves, and the multifarious forms of slavery to which humans subject themselves. Now, Gülen distinguishes between ibadah, worship, we're translating it worship, and ubudiyya, which we can translate as servanthood. For Gülen, the concept of ubudiyya bears the connotation of living in the consciousness of being God's servant, living in that consciousness. Whereas ibadah means fulfilling God's commands in one's daily life. In other words, ibadah refers to what the devout believer must do to serve and obey God in daily life, and ubudiyya indicates the attitude which the believer must take towards God. There's also a more subtle difference between the two concepts. Acts of worship, ibadah, consist of all physical and economic duties, which may include teaching school, financing dialogue projects, or delivering meat to the poor on the Feast of the Sacrifice. Servanthood, ubudiyat, recognizes that there's a deeper inner dimension to all these activities that requires a degree of reflective awareness on the part of the believer. What's the reason for such deeds of worship? How do they fit in to one's faithful response to God's commands? Why is it in accord with God's plan for humankind that people act in this way? The consciousness of the role that acts of obedience and service play in responding faithfully to God is what Gülen calls servanthood. It indicates an attitude that one is constantly standing before God in readiness to seek the divine master's pleasure by carrying out active service in accord with his will. Now, Gülen reaches back to the Sufi tradition to note a still deeper stage of worshipful involvement, that of devotion, or ubudah. While being neither a member of a Sufi order nor the founder of a new tariqat, Gülen acknowledges his indebtedness to the Sufi tradition for its promoting a comprehensive understanding of worship as service of God, as well as its constant encouragement to those on the path to worship God always and in every way. Like the Sufis, going back to Al-Ghazali, Gülen views worship as a way to obtain experiential knowledge of the truths of faith that otherwise would remain only theoretical postulates. As the believer moves to deeper stages and levels of worship, new perceptions of the realities of faith present themselves. Gülen offers the following advice to his disciples. He says, worship, and I'm quoting him, worship is the surest way to reach the most unshakable certainty in one's consciousness about the greatest truth, which is known only theoretically at the outset. The Sufi theoreticians spoke of ibadah, worship, as the service performed by ordinary believers striving on the path to God, while ubudiyya is the servanthood of those advanced souls whose mental and spiritual attitudes permit them to overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles. And ubudah, they call the deep devotion of those whose mental and spiritual states caused them to turn to God wholeheartedly and with profound feeling of being in God's company. Now, what characterizes the level of true devotion, ubuda, is an enthusiastic eagerness to serve God. It occurs when the worshiper moves beyond reluctance, objections, and grumbling, and performs one's duties with joyful spontaneity. So for the Sufis, ubuda, devotion, was a rare state of soul achieved by advanced practitioners on the Sufi path. Now, Gülen characteristically orients even the stage of ubuda, devotion, toward those members of the Jamaat engaged in what he sees to be the mission of Islam in the world, that is, serving God by serving others. He says, and I quote him, "This vital mission can only be realized by the devout and the godly, who never think of themselves except insofar as they see their own salvation through the salvation of others." The stage of devotion is, in the view of Gülen, not so much a spiritual achievement of the select few who have devoted their lives to the mystical path, but is rather an attitude that can be achieved by any pious Muslim who strives to overcome their selfish passions to serve God and others. This ideal of being one of the devout is one that Gülen has held up to countless young Muslims and has inspired many of them, like Oz, with whom I began this paper, to devote their lives to the service, the Hizmet. Gülen himself puts much hope in this new generation of idealistic young Muslims, and I quote him. He says, "The future will be the work of these devout people who can represent such a significant mission, showing their responsibility and exhibiting their accomplishments. The existence and continuation of our nation and nations related to us will be permeated with the thoughts, inspirations, and outcomes of a new civilization, and with the vast reviving dynamism of a rich culture carried aloft into the future on the shoulders of these devout people. They are the trustees of the sublime truths and heirs of our historical richness." You know, I've known the Gülen community for 30 years now, a long time, and I've met many of these people, and I can really see that this sums up very well this statement of Gülen's, the kind of person they're trying to form, he's trying to form through his teaching. By giving priority to worship as a comprehensive life of service to God, Gülen does not imply that ritual service performance is unimportant or optional. He stresses that our worship can add nothing to God's glory, which is infinite, but ritual worship benefits the believer in this world and the next. He says, and I quote him, "It is we who need to worship God, not God who needs to be worshiped." So I conclude. Gülen's approach to the concept of worship and servanthood is rooted in the generations of Muslim scholars who preceded him, but he gives to the concept his characteristic emphasis. After the Prophet himself, the figure most influential upon Gülen and most frequently cited in his writings is, not surprisingly, Mevlana, Jalaluddin Rumi. In speaking of servanthood, Gülen notes that Rumi's greatest boast about himself is not that he was a great saint or a person of great spiritual depth, but simply that he was God's servant. Gülen cites as a model of Islamic humility and joyful service the words of Mevlana, with their famous triple repetition for emphasis. And so now I quote from Mevlana, as Gülen has done in his writings. "I have become a servant, become a servant. Become a servant. I have bowed and doubled myself up with serving you. Servants or slaves rejoice when they are emancipated, whereas I rejoice when I become your servant. Thank you.